The fact is that there's no one on earth who wants to get at the throat of Europe or America. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, the usual enemies are not capable to, not interested in fighting or replacing the US or smashing up New York or something like that. The fact is that we're living with what Chalmers Johnson also called the boomerang effect. What comes back now are consequences of what we've done in the past. And of course, this disastrous policy concerning Ukraine, which should never have happened, also because the Ukrainian people did not want NATO membership. There's no indication of that before, after the invasion. You just do that. You don't listen to anybody. You drive your own hubris policies. You think you can get away with everything.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to two fantastic colleagues who have both been on this channel before, but not together yet. I've got with me Dr. Jan Oberg from Sweden and Professor David Gibbs from Arizona State University in the USA. While Jan Oberg has been working a lifetime on peace research and is an outspoken critic of militarism, Dr. Gibbs, who's a historian, is now working on a new project that he calls Guns, Butter and the Politics of Permanent War. I thought the two would probably be a great conversation partners, so here we are to discuss this topic, how there always seems to be money for war, but not for social spending. A very topical issue considering that the EU just announced more funding for weapons, presumably by cutting back on social spending. Jan, David, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe let me start with you, David. You told me this very intriguing title that you're working on of Guns, Butter and the Politics of Permanent War. What's going through your mind? What needs to be discussed, and what's the butter and the guns going to be about?
Well, the main thrust of this is that the world and the United States, I'm an American citizen, so I'll start with my own country, but also the world had an opportunity at the end of the Cold War for basically a demilitarized world. That was a real option. Gorbachev had proposed the idea of bilateral nuclear disarmament, which very likely would have led to a generalized nuclear disarmament. There were proposals that with the end of superpower conflict, you get genuine empowerment of the UN Security Council as the arbiter of international conflicts after that. Could reasonably expect a great deal of reduced spending on military activity. And the reorientation of that to social spending or environmental protection. Within the United States, the term we used was the peace dividend. There was a great expectation that with the massive downsizing of the military and what Eisenhower termed the military-industrial complex, we would get a peace dividend. It would go back to the public. There were different variations of that. Right-wing libertarians wanted to reduce taxes, give it back to the people, as they like to say, or people more on the left wanted to increase spending on social programs, healthcare, and the like. But one way or the other, the idea was diverting it away from military spending. And I was very struck by the fact, as many people were, that almost immediately after the Cold War was over, a large series of vested interests began looking for a new enemy and looking for a new justification for U.S. power. And for further military conflict in the world. One might think that military conflict is a bad thing. Having enemies is a bad thing. And there was a great deal of enthusiasm in the United States, having won the Cold War so asymmetrically, and it was felt that we had won the war. And there was a certain arrogance and hubris associated with that. And again, there was also anxiety that the vested interests that had benefited from the Cold War, which went beyond the military-industrial complex. I mean, I'm an academic in academia, benefited immensely. There was a huge amount of money flowing into academia associated with the Cold War. Many academics worked for, quietly, the Central Intelligence Agency or the military or something related to that. It was a bit of a gravy train, in fact, and it was going away. And so the idea was, for about a decade, there was an effort to, I think, find a new enemy. And eventually we did find a new enemy. And here we are in a war with one of our new enemies, Russia. And so the question was, for my project, how did that happen and why did that happen? And the reason I focused on the issue of guns versus butter is that the public in the United States, and I suspect in most countries, have always been at least somewhat suspicious of the idea of war. Because I think there's an instinctive understanding among most people that wars are in the first place bloody affairs, but also they're expensive affairs, and that inevitably spending for war will lower their living standards. And that really is true even in times of growth during the 50s and 60s. There's evidence that spending on military equipment is a less efficient way of creating jobs and creating economic growth than spending on non-military activity. And now you're getting basically a straightforward trade-off in both Europe and the United States between guns and butter. The more we spend on the military, as they're proposing to do in Europe, the less they will have for the European welfare state. The same is true in the United States. And so I think there's always been the suspicion among ordinary people that war is bad for them. And so there's always been a great deal of necessity on the part of elites to manufacture consent, to use Noam Chomsky's phrase, or the phrase he popularized. I think it was a journalist, I forget his name, who coined it. But in any case, to manufacture consent, to use fear and threat inflation, as some call it, as a means of generating popular support to overcome the natural reluctance ordinary people have to accepting war and accepting massive spending on war. And so I'm going to do this project on how that happened in the United States. I use archives, I'm a historian, and the archives are now mostly open on this question. And so I'd like to see what elite figures were saying in private, not just in public, but in private, about what their interests were, how they saw their interests, and how they would manipulate the situation to better advance their interests, and what types of threats they would try to develop, and how they would try to develop them, and ultimately how to convince the public to accept these things. So that's the focus of my research project, and I would see that as something that is very contemporary, because now we're dealing with the long-term effects of those issues as they've played out over decades, which is a very real war with Russia, which has threatened repeatedly to go nuclear, as well as a long-term process of remilitarization and expanded military spending, which seems to be in the process right now.
This is a fascinating project. And Jan, I mean, your peace research must also have touched a lot on just this issue of how war is being repackaged time and again to sell it to the general public. Can you speak to this?
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I think it's a slight difference between how the Americans would have thought of this after the Cold War and how we think of it in Europe. Because Europe has always been dependent and NATO exists to secure that the US will not be harmed in case there's a war. But our foundation, for instance, in, I think, 1990, wrote a long piece about, exactly as you said, the opportunities that arose with the demise of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And as a young student, when I was writing my dissertation, I went down and interviewed officers in NATO who were very, very kind and very sincere. And they said two things to me. We are here because we never want war again like the Second World War. And we are here because the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union is threatening to us. And we have to have a security against that. So the logical things would have been, which we also wrote 35 years ago, NATO should have gone, because NATO's raison d'etre was the existence of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, which certainly is to a certain extent like today, were considered as enemies exclusively, psychologically, politically, militarily. And at that time, the philosophy was that if we had balance between each other, it would be a stabilizing effect. And the Warsaw Pact always had maximum 60 to 80% of NATO's capacity in terms of military expenditures. Stronger on conventional armament, not that strong or comparatively strong because the US had nuclear weapons stationed, deployed in Europe. But the long story short was we totally missed the opportunity, deliberately, I would say, that Gorbachev was a very decent visionary and moral man, in my view, one of the greatest statesmen in modern time, if not the greatest, because what he said was, let's create a European house, a kind of United Nations in Europe, a place where we discuss what kind of grievances we have. The Olof Palme, the Swedish prime minister who put his name on this commission, talked about common security. Put simply, you can't be secure yourself if the other party is also not secure with you. And so I think what is very well described, and which you will find also in American archives, such as the National Security Archive, is that the Clinton administration cheated. Because the deal was, and that is well documented, the deal was that all important Western leaders sat with Gorbachev in his dacha outside Moscow and promised him that if the two Germanys could be united in one Germany and remain or be a member of NATO, we will not expand NATO 1 inch. Now that is documented very well. NATO lies about it. The European Union lies about it because they use some other, Gorbachev said something in some other kind of article or interview. The fact is that all this is written down and can be found in archives. There's no discussion about it. There's also this huge book of 550 pages by Sarotte about this whole thing, who was a political scientist, a young student writing her dissertation in Berlin at the time. So that's where we decided that we, meaning the US and NATO, decided that we want to be number one. We want to dominate. We take advantage of the fact that Russia is on its knees. And it was on its knees. I mean, I visited the country in the 70s and 80s. And towards the end, there was nothing in the shelves. Today, it's the world's fourth largest economy, larger than Japan. They have had a phenomenal growth, even with the sanctions. So the only thing we have done totally wrong was to expand NATO, to dominate and do it up under the skirts of Mother Russia. And the one that you cannot do, you might have been able to do Montenegro or Croatia or something like that, but you can't do Ukraine. Everybody said you cannot get Ukraine into, who knew about security issues. So we are where we are today because of this arrogant hubris and very unwise policies of NATO expansion. And then to do that, and forgetting to get the European citizens pay for this, because all this militarism is paid for by taxpayers. I would like to see a tax, resistance, a tax people are refusing to pay that part of their tax going to the military, because you can only get them to do that by fearology, lies, and propaganda, that the Russians are coming. Well, at the moment, I'm not sitting in Sweden, but in southern Sweden, where I live, you've had top flight guys of the Swedish military seriously saying that we cannot exclude that Putin will land in southern Sweden and make a partial occupation of Sweden. We're into Monty Python. This is totally idiotic, and nobody asks where is the scenario for this to happen. What has happened before he lands on the southern coast of Sweden? And so this disgraceful cheating of people and taxpayers is something that we see the results of today. And what they never thought of was that Trump would do what he has been saying he would do. And now these fools in Europe are sitting there having no clue of what to do because the US is leaving. It's leaving Ukraine. It's leaving everything it has said. It doesn't bother about Europe anymore. We know, all of us, that has to do with making some kind of modus vivendi with the Russians so that you can devote your energies to fighting China in the future, which will also be totally self-defeating and catastrophic for the West. But they don't see it that way. So long story short is we're the reason that we are in the situation you described that your project would deal with, in my view. And it could all have been avoided if instead we stretched out the hands and said, let's do common security, let's do conflict resolution instead of militarism and more armament.
But the question is, why did we not do it? Why, or not why did we not do it? Why did it not happen? Because the assumption is that militarization is driven by perceptions of fear, at least in international relations, right? And then the security dilemma and la 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 la. But once this fear goes away, the assumption is we would demilitarize. But now there's this very interesting study, and it's very important, 2019 by Sidita Kushi and Monica Duffy-Tuft, introducing a new military intervention project, a new data set on US military interventions, 1776 to 2019. And in that data set, they provided, I mean, you can look at it, and maybe, David, it would be interesting for you as a resource. They found in that data set, where they analyze about 200 military interventions the US did since 1776, they found out that more than 50% happened after the Second World War, and more than 50% of those 50% happened after the end of the Cold War. So the end of the Cold War did not lead to a reduction of US interventions. To the opposite, it went up. And this is counterintuitive. And we need to understand why that is, because even contemporary international relations theory, at least most of them, would suggest otherwise. So we are currently at a total loss. And yes, the stupidity that you're talking about, Jan, is completely correct. But how come that stupidity managed to manifest itself instead of the no-brainer, as in more money for butter? David, maybe you want to pick up again?
Well, I'll just note basically how astonishing the situation really is, that we're at a point with a recently outgoing Biden presidency in the United States. This is a presidency that basically put all significant negotiation with the Russians, completely froze it. There were no high-level discussions, no face-to-face discussions at a high level about anything, a few phone calls about very narrow issues from the Secretary of Defense to the Russian counterpart and so on, but very narrow issues, no presidential discussions. It was as if the United States and Russia had severed diplomatic relations. I say as if we still had embassies, but they're completely frozen, as if they didn't exist or virtually didn't exist. This never happened in the Cold War. This goes way beyond what happened in the Cold War. During the Reagan presidency, which I remember very well, it was never this bad. So in some respects, what we're seeing here is frankly, historically, what could be called an extremist foreign policy. That really is the only word for it, because it's more extreme than anything we've seen since 1945, a willingness to step right up to the brink of nuclear war and to almost laugh at the prospect that this might happen and dismiss it at a level, again, I have not seen before in American foreign policy. And it seems the same way in Europe. Europeans are just following along with the Americans like loyal dogs or something like that. Forgive the analogy, but it almost seems like that. And the situation is also, I mean, just one example. In 1982, there was a 12-year-old girl who wrote a letter to Yuri Andropov, the Soviet leader at the time. And she was invited to the Soviet Union, and with much fanfare, she visited the Soviet Union. Because she was a child, she was treated very gently in the American press, and there wasn't this kind of, she wasn't vilified because she was a child. And it got positive attention for the most part. That's unthinkable that would happen now. If even a child went to Russia under these circumstances, there'd be outright vilification of them as Russian agents. And so this is really kind of an unprecedented level of hate, also a personalization that's unprecedented. In the Cold War, our enemy was communism. Even during Stalin, there was never this intense personalization and personally directed hatred of the sort we're seeing with great regularity to Putin. It's almost a simplification of thinking, the return to the great man or the great villain theory of history as almost a singular organizing principle. And so this is really an extraordinary development. One other thing I do want to note, again, I haven't yet answered the question of why, but I just want to note how far this has gone. One other thing I do want to note is there's a very prominent political scientist named Chalmers Johnson who died now. I got to know him in life. He was a very prominent political scientist and a very pro-military one throughout his life. He was a longtime consultant to the CIA and had a top secret security clearance. He was a professor at Berkeley, but he was very closely integrated with the most militarist elements of the foreign policy establishment. He was detested by the anti-Vietnam War movement because he was so pro-war. He changed completely after the Cold War, and he wrote a series of books including the book Blowback, written in 2000, that argued that all of the security problems America faces, and you focus specifically on the United States, were created by American foreign policy. The United States military, the State Department, the National Security Council, these are insecurity generating machines, is how we put it. And that basically all the enemies we face were creations of past American actions. That's what he said. He wrote this a year before the 9/11 terrorist attacks, but it was complete vindication of everything he'd said. For what it's worth, I note that right after the terrorist attacks in 2001, I organized a panel at the American Political Science Association to discuss his ideas. He was there, and he was asked, what caused you to change your mind? Why did you move from this strongly celebratory image of America's overseas interventions to ones that are highly critical? And he said, it was the end of the Cold War. And he said, the whole idea I had in my head was precisely what Jan had mentioned, that the CIA and overseas bases and fleets around the world, nuclear weapons, these were necessary evils. They were evils, but necessary evils to protect against a Soviet threat. And the associated assumption was that if the Soviet threat ever was removed, these things would just go away. And he said, I was astounded by the fact that this happened. The Soviet Union was erased from the map, literally erased from the map. And there was very little change in US foreign policy. And he said, I had to draw conclusions that my assumptions about US foreign policy had all along been incorrect. And perhaps it was the US that was more the aggressor party in the Cold War. And he said it was very clearly the aggressor party after the Cold War because it had no security threats. It just went around creating security threats. And the question of this is why? And the answer is vested interests. You had a whole series of vested interests built up around the Cold War, beginning with the military-industrial complex, but extending much more broadly than that. You had the uniformed military, as I said, academia, journalism, think tanks, large corporations that don't even make weapons benefited greatly from the military-industrial complex, especially those that have heavy capital investments overseas and want them protected. This series of interests basically lamented the idea that US overseas bases and fleets around the world might go away, and all that spending on the military would go away without a threat. And so there really was an effort to not just continue the American empire of bases, to use Chalmers Johnson's phrase, but to expand that empire of bases and to take advantage of the collapse of the Soviet Union to establish a unipolar world under American domination and create a whole new series of justifications and a whole new series of enemies to allow the continuation and expansion of the interests that benefited from the Cold War. That's my hypothesis, and so I'll wait what I find in the archives, but that is the operating assumption I'm taking into this project that I'm beginning now.
Jan, in political science, we also talk about, instead of using the word history, we sometimes political scientists make up new nonsense terms. One of them is path dependence. The simple fact that you don't have a tabula rasa moment, right? You come into the new out of what you already have. Do you think that what David is talking about is just a unavoidable path dependence upon the structures that try to continue justifying themselves and therefore just continue warmongering and fearmongering?
No, honestly, I think we had a choice. We could have done differently. But there were reasons and motives and driving forces that went in the direction of where we are today. And that's, of course, the hubris. We are so good, we can do anything. We can split up Yugoslavia. We can do whatever we want because there's no Soviet Union anymore. That was a little bit of a breaking nation on these things. But then it was full blow, do what we like, do Iraq, do Afghanistan, do Syria, do whatever we want. That's one thing. But I think that there are some very obvious reasons, because David's question is, why did that happen? One is what I call the military industrial media academic complex. Eisenhower had a more simple version of it, but this is, as you say, it includes think tanks, research universities, the priesthood of security experts who have no idea about peace, by the way. Secondly, the West is going down. And when you feel that on all the power indicators, the only one where you're second to none is the military. Then you see everything as a military problem because you're in economy, your technological innovation capacity, your cultural penetration, the way people see abroad outside the West how legal you are is also falling. So what you do is you maximize that type of power where you are the strongest. And of course, that only accelerates the decline and fall. And the United States and the West are declining and falling. Third, I'm afraid I will offend some people, but I say the West today is led by kakistocracy. It is people who don't know what they do, who do not care about analysis, complexities, who do not look into the even 1 or 2 months or 1 year ahead consequences of their decisions today. It's panic, it's emotionalism, it's anything but rationality. I mean, in my honest view, there's no reason to apply political science or international relations or strategic doctrines or whatever to understanding as we did in the good old days. We have to look for psychiatry, theology, psychology, groupthink, that type of stuff to understand what is going on here, because there's simply no way you can use the classical concepts of political science or peace research for that matter to understand what is going on now. We're far into something very weird and very dangerous, and a groupthink that I see it just in Europe now. Everybody keeps on supporting Zelensky. I mean, is nobody seeing the writing on the wall? We're supporting a war that is already over, whether you like it or not. And everything would be stopped if one European leader would say, we have decided that we will do everything for Ukraine, but not NATO membership. That would be the end of it. But long story short, I think some of these things, and if you want to be philosophical finally about it, and maybe theological too, I'm not a theologist, but I have long had the suspicion that the Western Christian world cannot live without enemies. I think David had a very good, quick formulation of it. What did they do shortly after the Soviet Union had disappeared? Because, oops, you could not present that as a threat anymore. It never was to NATO or neutral states. They have never invaded NATO or neutral states. But then you found others. You found the Kuwait War. You find Yugoslavia. You found Milosevic was a new Hitler. You found Mohammed Farah Aidid in Somalia. You found and insisted that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons. You suddenly turned from calling Gaddafi Muammar Gaddafi or head of state or officer or colonel or whatever. He was dictator Gaddafi. And you can go on like that. I remember how Madeleine Albright ran around, obviously, every Monday morning trying to find out who should we hate and who should we see as a threat this week. And then the Russians were back. Because if you expand NATO, you provoke so much. If you expand NATO and do it up till and with Ukraine, and then it happened. In my view, to a certain extent, you could say that Putin fell into the trap, because that was what all the military, industrial, media, academic complex and the Western world needed. To tell them that they are coming tomorrow. We cannot even have Russian orchestras playing. We cannot have more than 5 people at the embassies. We will have nothing to do with them. We cancel flights. We cancel news. We do everything that we not even did in the old Cold War. So now we have the beautiful enemy that the military, industrial, media, academic complex needs if you are a kakistocracy. You know, this kind of stupidity was not what Willy Brandt would have done, or Bruno Kreisky, or de Gaulle, or Urho Kekkonen, or Anker Jörgensen, or Olof Palme, because they were intellectuals and they had an experience of warfare. Now, these guys, if you look at Kaya Kallas today, you see where we are at. The level can't be lower intellectually.
But we need an explanation of how this happens as a sociological phenomenon, right? Because it's not because there's evil puppet masters on the top. I mean, there are people who are more powerful than others, but this is a system, right? That where different parts interlink with each other, and we need an explanation for why the hell you would go to the suicidal mode of, especially in Europe, but in the US too, in the view of what you just said about the Biden administration, risking nuclear war for no good reason in good times or coming out of good times, right? Whereas in the bad times, when things were much more tense and when ideological conflict was raging, that bred more realism in terms of trying to actually get to de-escalation. David, do you have... What's your thinking? Because like also the whole democratic peace theory is that democracies strive for peace because the people are the ones who pay the price, right? And therefore they want more butter and less war. But it seems that this was always wishful thinking and not actual reality. And I think your research will speak to that.
Ultimately, I take a kind of economics and a materialist view. I have kind of a Marxist background, so I do always look at economics, economic motivations for these things. Economic motivation clearly here was the set of vested interests that benefited from the Cold War, didn't want to lose that, as I discussed. And so that, I think, is the root cause. The problem is, in order to sustain this agenda, you need propaganda. You need manufacture of consent, as I noted. And the problem with that is, over time, elites tend to believe their own propaganda and get overcome by it, which tends to produce the kind of kakistocracy, to use Jan Oberg's phrase, and the kind of self-defeating policies we've been getting here, which is that you have to create this enormous world-class world historical boogeyman named Vladimir Putin, who is involved in every imaginable thing. In the United States, anytime anything goes wrong, it's always Putin must have done it. If there's a power station that fails in Vermont or something like that, there must be some evidence that Russian intelligence did it, literally. We've been seeing that over the last 8 years. And I think that people start to believe their own propaganda and their own craziness, and it has gotten quite crazy. I think a particularly signal event was the election of Donald Trump in this country. Again, Europe, Jan can speak to that. You can speak to that, Pascal. But in the United States, my own country, the election of Donald Trump, I think, really has unsettled people's brains and ceased to enable them to think clearly. And immediately, the explanation that people gave, rather than giving the explanation that the Democrats had run a really bad campaign with a really bad candidate and had lost touch with a large part of the population, particularly working class people, rather than accept those facts, which are clear as day, they had to come up with a conspiracy theory. And the conspiracy theory is Russia did it. The reason we had Donald Trump is because Russia created Donald Trump. It was literally the explanation. And they hammered away at that for years. And the press was just obsessed with that issue, absolutely obsessed with it. People believed it like religion. And there was a kind of almost religious quality to this. And so I think that added a toxic element to American politics that also influenced foreign policy, which is that Russia is so evil as to create this monster in American politics named Donald Trump. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, by the way, and so it's certainly not in any way a defense of him, but it's acknowledgement of the fact that this extraordinary creation of this boogeyman, Donald Trump, with his mastermind boogeyman of Putin, is an utter fantasy. But that's what we have, and that greatly intensified the hatred of Russia, and it became an intense, personalized hatred by large parts of the American population. We've seen a realignment in American politics. Traditionally, it was the Democrats who were the somewhat less warlike party, and they were still warlike, but not quite as much as the Republicans. And not quite as enthusiastic about military spending, about things like the Central Intelligence Agency and so on. Now that's reversed, and now the Democrats are much more the warlike policy. An event last night that occurred was that Donald Trump gave what's called a State of the Union address. It's a big yearly address the president gives to Congress, and it was a very partisan event. And the Democrats did what they always do, which is they put up an up-and-coming figure in their party to give a response to the State of the Union address. And the Democrats selected Alyssa Slotkin, who's a senator from Michigan, newly elected, who had spent her career in the Central Intelligence Agency. And in her speech, she began by noting how proud she was to have worked for the CIA. And in the middle of her speech, she noted that She's very angry at Trump for moving away from the legacy of Ronald Reagan and what a great president Ronald Reagan was. And Ronald Reagan was so good at confronting the Russians, something Trump supposedly will not do. And that very strongly implying two things. First of all, the Democrats are now the party of Ronald Reagan. Secondly, the Democrats are the party of the Central Intelligence Agency. One got the impression that Senator Slotkin isn't the senator from Michigan, she's the senator from the CIA. And so we do have a situation where increasingly it is the Democrats who identify with Ronald Reagan and people like the Cheney family, Liz and Richard Cheney. And the Democrats have a love affair now with the intelligence services, beginning with the CIA and the FBI. And so this is a real realignment in American politics. It's of dramatic proportions. Donald Trump is not a man of peace. There's no doubt about that. But he's definitely not that enthusiastic about making new wars. He is somewhat skeptical about the idea of new wars. I think he instinctively understands, first of all, the public doesn't really want that anymore. The public has been fed up with wars. And if Donald Trump is one thing, he doesn't have a head for politics, but he does have a nose for politics. And I think he does understand what the American public really wants, which is not any new wars at this point. And the Democrats seem to be clinging to the idea of having war after war after war, and they don't want to give up on this war, even though it is very definitely lost, as Jan had noted. And so there's an element of irrationalism here going on both sides of the aisle, I would say. And one more point I do want to note is that in the United States, there's a long tradition that great American presidents, to use that phrase, are presidents who are foreign policy presidents. Every president since Truman isn't that interested in domestic policy for the most part. They're interested in foreign policy. And that usually means being a war president. American presidents aspire to be war presidents because that's what produces presidential greatness. Joseph Biden would have to be the high point of that. I have no doubt he saw himself as starting a war with Russia, and there's no doubt he provoked this war with Russia. Starting a war with Russia would enable him to become a war president. He would defeat Russia. That's what he expected to do anyway. He would knock it out of the league as the great power. He would reaffirm American greatness for decades to come. And he would go down in history as one of the great American presidents. I'm sure that's how he saw this. The result has been a disaster. I mean, the truth is, all the wars we've had have been disasters. Iraq was a disaster. Afghanistan was a disaster. Overthrowing Gaddafi was a disaster. If you look closely, Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo are basket cases. Really, the Yugoslav wars, which people present were successes, they were disasters too, and even people don't realize it yet. And above all, the war with Russia is going to be a colossal disaster, even though it seems to be ending now. And there really isn't any sense that people learn from their mistakes. On the contrary, president after president wants to go on starting new wars, imagining they'll be better than the last war. But ultimately, I think the root cause of this is vested interest and the desire of vested interests, those that have a monetary interest in war and militarism. That really is the root of the problem. But it does eventually produce a certain insanity, and we're seeing some of the effects of this insanity now.
Jan, I mean, we have had other moments when entire societies went to a good extent mad. We've had the Soviets who had this moment and killed millions of their own in the 30s and 40s or let millions die. We've had the Chinese in the 50s and 60s who again killed millions of their own and destroyed a good part of their own Chinese heritage. These are moments when countries turn inward and turn self-destructive. Do you think we are currently in a self-destructive phase of the West? Of just this self-destruction is also coupled to basically inviting foreign destruction of the self.
Well, I think that we have already touched upon it in a way that this is totally self-destructive, because the fact is that there's no one on earth who wants to get at the throat of Europe or America, which you might say is strange, but China, Russia, Iran, Korea, North Korea, the usual enemies are not capable to and not interested in fighting or replacing the US or smashing up New York or something like that. The fact is that we're living with what Chalmers Johnson also called the boomerang effect, the What comes back now are consequences of what we've done in the past. And of course, this disastrous policy concerning Ukraine, which should never have happened, also because the Ukrainian people did not want NATO membership. There's no indication of that before or after the invasion. You just do that. You don't listen to anybody. You drive your own hubris policies. You think you can get away with everything. And in the final end, what happens is that anybody who is number one or sees him or herself as number one in a system is going to fall unless you have a great amount of humility and wisdom. Because if you're number 10 in a system, you have nine others to learn from. But if you're number one, you only teach and you don't learn and you don't sense what is going on. There's a gigantic groupthink now where people in the West, the whole European Union, particularly the women in it, Mette Frederiksen in Denmark, von der Leyen, and the foreign policy Callas, are totally convinced of their own policies being the only possible ones. And that means huge armament, rearmament now. There's talk about $800 billion more in Europe after all these increases already. And mind you, the level of intellectuality is indicated by somebody talking, not somebody, everybody, talking seriously about military expenditures being a percentage of the gross national product. I mean, this is perverse. This is absurd. What you do is normally you do a complex civilian and military threat analysis on the time horizon of 20 years or whatever for your country. And then you allocate, you find out which threats you can do something about, which you cannot do anything about, which are likely or not very likely. And then you set off money and find it in a budget. This whole thing about, military expenditures as 2, 3, 5% of the gross national product is for idiots. It's intellectual dwarfs, because this is not a way to decide what your security policy should be. There's a total marketization. There's capitalist thinking that everything is about money. We set off money, then we solve the problem. No, you don't. You end up in militarism and self-destruction.
Yeah, but
it is very, very tragic. It's very tragic. I don't know whether the historical examples you gave us, with China or Russia, will apply to the West. But that is the fundamental trend that you see now. And Mr. Trump will also fall. All his projects cannot succeed. Taking Greenland, taking Canada,
That's not serious.
taking, making Las Vegas out of Gaza. This is bizarre. This man will run into one wall after the other in the long run, or not so long run.
But the GDP figure, like military expenditure as a percentage of GDP, is even dumber, because you can reach it. You could reach that goal also by just halving your GDP, right? If your economy goes down and your military expenditure remains the same, you will also actually get to those numbers. It's dumb on so many levels. And that's what is
happening in Europe now.
David, do you think that you will find traces in the archives for also like how this narrative nudging then happens? This is a new idea, this debt to GDP narrative for military expenditure, and we've had other such moments. I mean, we often talk about this in international relations and political science as securitization, making everything a security problem. And I think the idea that everything is a war more or less started somewhere around the idea with the war on terror, and then war on drugs, then war on terror, and everything is becoming a war, and we mentally create a battlefield for everything. Even COVID was clearly framed as a war, right, with the frontline helpers and so on. And if you think about it, international law tried to do the opposite. The 19th century was a movement to try to create clear distinction, war, not war, civilian and combatants, and clean that up and make war as small as possible. And somehow we managed to expand it into everything. Therefore everything, even butter, again, becomes an issue of warfare. Do you think we need to go into this analysis of words as well and how they went astray?
Well, what you're describing here in terms of the militarization of everything, in terms of language, that began with the early Cold War. The United States, in particular, I think of how Eisenhower wanted to create the interstate highway system, create control, large highways made based on the German autobahns, and he had to call it the National Security Highway Act of 1958 because, and the justification was that it was a way of integrating regional defense networks. And so even something that was really purely civilian in character had to be sold in military terms because that's the only way you sell things. There was I think that actually it's 1956. In 1958, there was the National Security Education Act, which increased federal aid to science and math education across the country. It was justified in military terms. We had to keep up with the Soviets. So pretty much anything that was done, civil rights, the decision to desegregate, it was felt and it was openly said that we had to do this partly because the Soviets are gaining propaganda value at American discrimination, American holding down people who are African American. All that basically was bad for America from the standpoint of the Cold War. So the Cold War was used to justify everything. And so it shouldn't come as a surprise at all that this just continued right into the post-Cold War period. Some of this is, again, has at root cause, there are root causes to these things, which I've identified, but an element of this is intellectual laziness, that we just keep doing the same thing we've always been doing. One example of that is, why did we select Russia as our enemy? Well, we're used to having Russia as an enemy, and because in their earlier version of the Soviet Union, they were an enemy. So if you're going to create an enemy, why not just do the same one we've always done? And so I think some of this was just a kind of mental inertia. Nevertheless, there was definitely an effort to find an enemy. People were saying in the 1990s how much they regretted the passing of the Cold War and how much America needs an enemy to organize its foreign policy and to justify its presence overseas, to justify NATO, to justify all of these things. And so there really was an active search for an enemy. And it's not a surprise that we found an enemy. And this was an inevitable result of basically an effort to justify a continuation of essentially Cold War policies when the Cold War was over.
Jan, because you also speak about media, and if you think back, I mean, the 2000s were also the years of all of these movies, Independence Day and Armageddon, and like the external, the Cold War threat was gone, but James Bond remained. The idea with the license to kill and of the evil abroad that the good shining knights need to go and defeat. So in a sense, did we culturally get stuck in a mentality that then made us eventually re-find all of the enemies that we needed?
Yeah, that's one thing. I think that has always been there. You walk into any bookshop today, there are tons of books about war history, no books about peace history. You walk around cities, there's no peace museums, there are only war museums or memorials. You walk around to, even fashion is now influenced by the military, camouflage or whatever. Even cars look now like tanks in a very brutal kind of, aesthetics, where when I was a child or younger, a beautiful car was a long, low, elegant thing with raw power and stuff like that. And the word peace has disappeared. We're at the point where peace has disappeared from research, from politics, and from the media. I can't remember having heard a journalist in Scandinavia saying to the prime minister or foreign minister or defense minister, do you think that this will lead to peace? Or how do you think your policy will lead to peace? Peace is used now like Stoltenberg used it in NATO. Armament and warfare is the road to peace. It's an Orwellian formulation. And so I think we've always been a militarist culture. There's nothing new in it except in the sense that it's been intensified tremendously the last few years. And that, as I said, the Christian West seemingly cannot live without enemies. And that's very tragic. The Buddhists and the Confucianists, etc., they can live with friends. We can't live with friends. We see everybody as potentially a danger, whether immigrants or countries or economies or new technologies or whatever is seen in the specter of enmity rather than, oh, let's cooperate and see what we can do together. And my judgment is the West is finished. It's just how bad it will get before it recognizes that it's finished, because the 88% of the world's humanity who do not belong to the West are already roaring ahead and saying, the West is genocide, the West is permanent war, the West is militarism, the West is a crazy American president. Let's do something more serious. And that is very tragic. I've never been anti-Western, but I see with great tragedy and pain in my heart how the West is destroying itself.
But it wasn't always like that. I mean, especially in the United States. I mean, David, if you compare what is happening now and also how the United States is aware of the entire arms part, the military-industrial complex, if you compare that to 100 years ago and the Nye Committee and the outcry in the United States once it got clear how much the neutral United States benefited of selling weapons to all sides of the First World War, well, especially the Allied side. But this was a real shock to the U.S. psyche right at the moment, the Nye Committee that worked all of this up. And then it created this neutrality acts in the United States that were supposed to keep the U.S. out of war. And that didn't work. It went in a completely different way. But can you see a trajectory of the U.S. like engaging with this?
Say that a major turning point was the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and that by my estimation, Roosevelt had no intention of bringing the United States into conflict with the Soviets. He obviously did bring the United States into World War II. He was eager to do that for a variety of reasons, but he wanted that to be a singular event. And he was, all the evidence I've seen is that he did not have any intention of starting a Cold War, nor did he have an intention. It's very interesting that in building the Pentagon, which he built at great expense, he didn't intend that to be occupied by the military after World War II was over. It was considered to be too large for them, which is significant. Harry Truman, of course, replaced him. We all know basically what happened after that. But I think in particular of a very famous speech he gave in 1944, in which he proposed elaborately guaranteed full employment, guaranteed health care, guaranteed housing. He basically was talking fairly explicitly about turning the United States into what Sweden became in its heyday, you might say, during the heyday of social democracy. That was explicitly the language he was using in that speech. And he had a phrase there, interestingly enough, in that speech and in others like it, he said nothing about building the United States up as a military power with bases overseas. There was nothing about that. He did make nationalistic notes, though, of an interesting sort. He said, this is virtually almost a direct quote, "It is our duty to lay the foundations for an American standard of living higher than ever known before." And so that's interesting. An American standard of living suggests a kind of, we would show national greatness by showing the world how well we treat our own people, the high standard of living we give to our own people. It's a very different conception of national greatness from what happened after 1945, of course. But I think that's rather interesting. The Americans are a nationalistic people. I personally am not. I don't see any great need for nations, but most Americans are very nationalistic. And there are different ways of appealing to nationalism. And one way is giving people a high standard of living, is showing what a great country we are. That's one way to do it. And I think that, the United States has become obsessed with the idea of showing nationalism in terms of overseas military expansion. I think we are at the end of that process because the United States simply isn't what it used to be. American decline was inevitable. It was a simple basis of the fact that China is growing much more rapidly than the United States. But the two wars, the wars in Ukraine and the wars in the Middle East, have greatly accelerated American decline. And so things are not going to be the same after this. And I think we in the United States need to rethink what it means, basically, to define nationalism, to define American nationalism. I don't see American nationalism going away just because I think that's so embedded in the national psyche, but I think some idea of redefining nationalism away from militarism and getting away from the idea of military expansion is the way I'd like to see it. I'm hoping that you can get, in no way would Trump basically be the bearer of this, but there could be some kind of authentic peace movement that will be orchestrated around the idea of high living standards instead of military expansion. In Europe, I would hope to see this as well. I mean, some of the people I've been looking at in Europe are Sarah Wagenknecht in particular, whom I don't know how you gentlemen feel about her, but I had high hopes for her. I was very sorry to see she didn't make it into the Bundestag. But it seemed to me she was offering a vision somewhat like what I'm presenting here, that this is very bad for the people of Germany because it will lower their living standards, it will damage their welfare state. And she was a very articulate expression of that. And hopefully we'll see more of that occurring on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah, but just as the right wing, the AfD, actually has different motivations, but it's a similar rhetoric, because what they're saying is it is bad for Europe if we bomb Middle Eastern countries, because then all of these Middle Eastern come to Europe and we don't want them here. Therefore, let's not bomb their houses, which I think the motivation is weird, but the conclusion is correct. It's like, we shouldn't bomb these people because nobody really wants to go abroad, right? And the Europeans should understand that. But, Jan, the thing is, the Europeans, in my view, are not, most of them are much less nationalistic or patriotic than the Americans. There's much less of flag waving, at least in most European countries, if I compare to what I see in the US. But they're going along with this US, with that way of thinking about what grander means. And grander to the Europeans means being part of the alliance where the top dog has all of these bases. Can you make sense of it psychologically?
No, I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. I wish these days that I were educated as one. No, I can't. But I think there has been the tragedy of the European Union has been that it has basically never managed to become another Western power. It has never been able to manifest itself as European vis-a-vis the Americans. It is a total intellectual, economic, technological, etc. Submissiveness that, of course, is conveyed or transferred through the NATO membership when it comes to security politics. And you still have all these people after what has happened and what Trump has done the last couple of months. It's still, as late as this morning, the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, says that the US is still our most important ally. She's not aware that this is already gone. And she talks about that after Trump has said that he wants Greenland. He said it last night, too. And I think we're going to get it one way or the other. I mean, here you have a president who is turning other territories into America. And
his name is not Vladimir Putin. You don't even
have a protest against it.
And his name is not Vladimir Putin. And still the Europeans
that's a tragedy. Along. That's a tragedy of Europe. They have all been 100% engaged with Putin, and they are not seeing that the threat now is coming from the West, from the new America. And I can tell you there are now two Cold Wars in Europe. There's not one, as there always was. There are two Cold Wars. Europe is doomed because it cannot understand that it has to stand in a completely different way on its own feet. And that means economic independence and not wasting the money on warfare and supporting Ukraine. You should support a peace solution, negotiated solution, and not any more nonsense about arming Ukraine to defeat Russia. That's where the European leaders still are, and that's damn dangerous.
Maybe the last word going to David, because it is your project. Do you see, or do you have any hypothesis of what can change this this permanent war state? Are we doomed to live with it, or do we need a miracle to get out of it? Or at some point, will the political realization kick in that it's either the permanent war state or humanity? One of the two will leave. well, no, actually, sorry, the permanent war still will leave with humanity. It's like the cancer that eats its host.
What I'm hopeful is to see in the future a anti-war movement of the left emerge on both sides of the Atlantic. You know, you've had essentially the abandonment of anti-war by most of the left. It's very striking, again, in Germany. We've discussed this before, how the Greens went from almost a pacifist party to being the most warlike party, one of the most warlike parties in Europe. I would like to see, as a result of that, what you've had is the AfD, as was noted, that is now the leading anti-war party. And it's a very dangerous party, in my view, and for all sorts of reasons. Donald Trump is a very dangerous figure. And the idea is that if anti-war is abandoned by the left, well, then the right will mobilize it. Also, I think there's a class element, the working class. Thomas Piketty has noted, and he's dead on this is clear cut. The left on both sides of the Atlantic, in terms of both the establishment left, the socialist parties in Europe, the Democratic Party of the United States, but also the activist left, have abandoned the working class. The working class now votes for the right. Donald Trump got got more votes from the working class than the Democrats did. The activist left is even more posh than the Democrats are in the United States. And I think into that breach will fall people like Donald Trump and the AfD. If the working class is mobilized by the left, they'll be mobilized by the right. I would like to see a more authentic kind of left emerge on both sides of the Atlantic, going back to its working class roots and moving away from people with advanced degrees and high incomes, people like me, and also adopt the position of anti-war, noting anti-war is bad for living standards, beginning with that fact. I mean, it's bad in other ways too, obviously. But I think that I'm very impressed by the idea that most people are interested in paying the rent. That's the first thing, paying off their credit card. And I think if you can reach people based upon their immediate financial needs, that's the best way to reach them. And I'm hopeful that in the future, we'll see something like that emerge, both in Europe and in the United States, and that it will sideline parties like the AfD and movements like Make America Great Again, and produce something of a more substantial anti-war left, and that the public, and will mobilize the public, and it'll be the public that will insist they want the money spent on butter, not on guns. That's my hope. If there is a way out of it, I think that's the only way I can see.
I like the final words, although, we now know where we want to go, and we have the big blank space of how to get there, but we'll fill the blank space little by little. Gentlemen, I would like to thank you both for your time today. David Gibbs in the US and Jan Oberg in Sweden. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pascal. Thank you, Jan. It was a pleasure meeting you, Jan.
Thank you so much. You too.